I'd like you to open your Bible with me to Luke chapter 6. I want to begin this morning by reading three different events from the life of Jesus, three different accounts. And as we read through these in Luke, I'd like for you to think to yourself, what do these all have in common? What do all of these three have in common? So first we're starting out in Luke chapter 6, and I'd like to begin reading then in verse 6. Gospel of Luke chapter 6 and verse 6. Now it happened on another Sabbath also, that he entered the synagogue and taught. And a man was there whose right hand was withered. So the scribes and Pharisees watched him closely, whether he would heal on the Sabbath, that they might find an accusation against him. But he knew their thoughts and said to the man who had the withered hand, "Arise and stand here." And he arose and stood. Then Jesus said to them, "I will ask you one thing. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save a life or to destroy?" And when he had looked around at them all, he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And he did so, and his hand was restored as whole as the other. But they were filled with rage and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. Luke chapter 13. Luke chapter 13, and we'll start reading in verse 10. Now he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath, and behold, there was a woman who had a spirit of infirmity 18 years, and was bent over, and could in no way raise herself up. But when Jesus saw her, he called her to him and said to her, "Woman, you are loosed from your infirmity." And he laid hands on her, and immediately she was made straight, and she glorified God. But the ruler of the synagogue answered with indignation, because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath. And he said to the crowd, "There are 6 days on which men ought to work. Therefore come and be healed on them, and not on the Sabbath day." The Lord then answered him and said, "Hypocrite, does not each one of you on the Sabbath loose his ox or donkey from the stall and lead it away to water it? So ought not this woman, being a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has bound, think of it, for 18 years, be loosed from this bond on the Sabbath?" And when he said these things, all his adversaries were put to shame, and all the multitude rejoiced for all the glorious things that were done by him. Chapter 14 and verse 1. Chapter 14, verse 1. Now it happened as he went into the house of one of the rulers of the Pharisees to eat bread on the Sabbath, that they watched him closely. And behold, there was a certain man before him who had dropsy. And Jesus answering spoke to the lawyers and Pharisees, saying, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" But they kept silent. And he took him and healed him and let him go. Then he answered them, saying, "Which of you, having a donkey or an ox that has fallen into a pit, will not immediately pull him out on the Sabbath day?" And they could not answer him regarding these things. Do you know why the Pharisees and the rulers of the Jews could not answer him concerning these things? It's because they did not understand the first thing about the Sabbath day and what the Sabbath was intended for, and the lessons that Jesus was teaching them by performing his miracles on the Sabbath. I want to tell you, you go through the Gospel of Luke and you find out pretty quick that Sabbath and Sabbath labor of Jesus is one of the themes running through as a spine of the book of Luke. What was Jesus teaching them? Do I understand the Sabbath? Do I understand the lessons that Jesus was teaching? It is very clear that Jesus intentionally was inviting the tension and the controversy with the Jewish leadership on the Sabbath. What was he teaching? And what am I to get from it? That's what we're studying and exploring in the rest of our time together this morning. And to do so, we first have to go back when God was teaching the Israelites about the Sabbath and Sabbath rest, and what he wanted them to learn and gain from it, and to see that Jesus was actually coming to restore Sabbath law and Sabbath instruction. And one practical thing I want to say before we launch in further into this lesson: this is not a bad thing. It's a necessary thing. But a lot of our public studies together about the Sabbath very often turns toward, this is why we don't keep the Sabbath today, and why no religious group can impose the Sabbath observance on anyone. You know, we have to take the battles that come to us. But it's unfortunate if in all the arguing away of why we don't keep the Sabbath today, we actually lose sight of the true Sabbath that God was trying to teach us about. So let's go back in our Bibles then and first see what God was wanting to teach Israel on the Sabbath, and then we will return to a couple of events of Jesus' life where we see even more clearly what it is that he's teaching us about that. So let's go back in our Bibles to Exodus chapter 20. Of course, as you're turning back to Exodus 20, we're already taught in the first book of the law, back in Genesis, that in 6 days God created the heavens and the earth, and then on the seventh day God rested. Of course, what that means is not that God kind of kicked back and said, "Whew, that was just really hard. I need to take a breather now and rest." No, it's he ceased from the creative work so that he could begin the work of rest for creation. And so God goes back to that here in Exodus chapter 20 when he's giving the Ten Commandments to Israel. We see then, beginning in verse 8, the Sabbath law. So Exodus 20 in verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. I believe here, God is teaching the people, it's not just a matter of, now you're to commemorate something that I'm teaching you about the order of creation. I think the idea of labor and then of rest, and a Sabbath rest, is also a reminder to them that when you're thinking about work and you're thinking about rest, and the creation events, it has to take their minds back to the Garden of Eden. And after man and woman were in a state, in a condition, in which they did not have to labor and toil by the sweat of their brow to raise crops and food, it was provided for them there in the garden. They were to tend and keep it, but the blessing of the garden and of food was God's gift to them. And after sin, it was the curse on man that he would have to work and labor and scratch and dig out of the ground, his livelihood. That toil and labor, in a sense, were a curse and a reminder of the garden sin. I think it's God's way of saying then, honor then my effort to kind of bring you back spiritually into a state of rest with me. But it's not just creation that the Sabbath commemorates. After the Exodus, and after the wandering through the wilderness, the Sabbath is also to represent when they enter the promised land. They're entering into a land of rest, where they would live in cities they did not build, walls they had not constructed, vineyards they had not dug out, cisterns they had not excavated, and they're living in a land flowing of milk and honey, a kind of Sabbath rest. Go over with me to Deuteronomy chapter 5. And here in the second giving of the law, the repetition of the Ten Commandments, in Deuteronomy 5, notice there's the additional comment on what the Sabbath was for. It's not just a celebration and commemoration of rest, but of liberation. In Deuteronomy chapter 5, notice verse 12. Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your ox, nor your donkey, nor any of your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates, that your male servant and your female servant may rest as well as you. And remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there by a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. So now we learn it's not just a commemoration of creation and a reminder that God is at the work of bringing His cursed creation back into Sabbath rest. It's a reminder that the Sabbath was to remind them that they were liberated from slavery. Bonds and slavery was loosed. And so here are the twofold purposes of the Sabbath. Is to remind the nation that you receive rest in your blessings from God and you receive your freedom because of God. And what that teaches this, and it kind of leads us into understanding, the Sabbath was not just a day where the Israelites were to stay at home and just sit there and put their feet up and do absolutely nothing. The Sabbath day was a day of physical rest from labor, but it was a day of spiritual energy and of spiritual productivity. Go over back a few pages to Leviticus chapter 23. Every Sabbath day, there was to be spiritual activity that was to go on. Leviticus chapter 23 is a chapter that catalogs the days on which the Israelites were to hold what was called a holy convocation. The word holy means it's sacred. It is spiritual. And convocation is just a fancy word that means a gathering or an assembly. A con means together, and a vocation is a calling. Like your vocal cords call out, so the convocation was the calling together. Hey, come together, come assemble. So what we're doing right now, this is a holy convocation. It's holy in its intent, design, and purpose, and it is a convocation. It's a calling together. Now, it's a standing call. It's an understood routine call, but this is what we're doing together. It's an assembly. And the Israelites were to do that every week on the Sabbath. Leviticus 23 and verse 3. 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, a holy convocation. You shall do no work on it. It is the Sabbath of the Lord in all your dwellings. So what this means is that God expected the Israelites to meet together, to have what we would call a church service, an assembly service, where they would gather together. Now, what do you think they're going to be doing during this assembly? You think they're going to just come together and gather in their local communities and just sit there and stare at one another? No, obviously they would be doing things like reading the Scriptures. They would have someone get up to explain the Scriptures, to apply the Scriptures to their lives and the law to them, to exhort and to encourage them. A lot of the kind of thing that we're trying to do right now. That's what God expected them to do on the Sabbath day, every Sabbath. But there were some special Sabbaths. Turn over a couple of chapters to Leviticus 25. Every year, in a sense, was to be counted by the Jews until they got a Sabbath of years. So 6 years, and then on the seventh year was to be considered a Sabbath year. Look down to Leviticus 25 and verse 2. Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land which I give you, then the land shall keep a Sabbath to the Lord. 6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather its fruit. But in the seventh year there shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land, a Sabbath to the Lord. You shall neither sow your field nor prune your vineyard. What grows of its own accord of your harvest, you shall not reap, nor gather the grapes of your untended vine, for it is a year of rest for the land. And the Sabbath produce of the land shall be food for you, your male and female servants, your hired man, and the stranger who dwells with you, for your livestock and the beasts that are in your land, all its produce shall be for food. So they're to count then every seventh year. That year you will not work your land. And the things that naturally then grow up because of the sowing of the previous year and what was left, don't touch it. Because it's not for the people's sake so much. He says it's actually the land's rest. And your animals rest, the beast of burden. They rest the seventh year from the labor. Now, you might think to yourself, and the Israelites would think, what are we going to live on? How are we going to survive not just in the Sabbath year, but what about the eighth year then? What are we going to eat? What are we going to do? God said, in effect, don't worry about that. I'll provide for you. Look over to verse 18. So you shall observe my statutes and keep my judgments and perform them, and you will dwell in the land in safety. Then the land will yield its fruit, and you will eat your fill and dwell there in safety. And if you say, what shall we eat in the seventh year, since we shall not sow nor gather in our produce? Then I will command my blessing on you in the sixth year. And it will bring forth produce enough for 3 years, and you shall sow in the eighth year, and eat old produce until the ninth year. Until its produce comes in, you shall eat of the old harvest. What this sounds to me is that the Sabbath year observance was an education and having faith and reliance on God as the source of blessings, to imprint on them the very lesson that our brother was trying to get across to us in thinking about our contribution, our offering to God. It is trust in Him from whom all blessings flow. And God said, you worry about the Sabbath year, the eighth year, I'll make enough in the sixth that you will have enough to survive on. But it's not just every Sabbath, and then the Sabbath of years that was special. They were to count a Sabbath of Sabbath years, meaning 7 times 7. And that is, then in the 50th year was to be an especially holy and special Sabbath, the year of Jubilee. Go back to verse 8 now. And you shall count 7 Sabbaths of years for yourself, 7 times 7 years. And the time of the 7 Sabbaths of years shall be to you 49 years. Then you shall cause the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month. On the day of atonement you shall make the trumpet to sound throughout all your land. And you shall consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout all the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you, and each of you shall return to his possessions, and each of you shall return to his family. So the word jubilee comes from the Hebrew word for a ram's horn and the blast on the ram's horn. And so the idea here is that at the 7th month, the 10th day, the Day of Atonement, in that 50th year, the priests were to sound the ram's horn, and as these horns were sounding throughout the land, that was to be the signal that the year of freedom is now being commemorated the entire year. So what that meant was the Jubilee, or that is the freedom year, meant that if you had leased out your land because of poverty to someone else, that land comes back to its family inheritance for good. And what does it mean then, back in verse 10, each of you shall return to his family? What does that mean? If because of poverty, indebtedness, any number of reasons, an Israelite had to sell himself as an indentured slave to another, regardless of the remaining debt, regardless of what the fair value and price of his service remained, in that 50th year, he was unconditionally free, no questions asked. The matter and the debt is settled. Complete, clean slate every 50th year. That was meant to be a blessing, where God is telling Israel that work and toil and slavery will not last forever among you. Now, with all these things that we've talked about, how could it be that an Israelite would ever not keep the Sabbath holy and honor it? It happened. In fact, in Numbers chapter 15, we're told a story where the Israelites found a man who was gathering up sticks on the Sabbath. And they brought him in before the Lord, and you know the Lord's answer? Execute him, because he violated the Sabbath. God took this so seriously throughout the law. In fact, come with me to the book of Nehemiah, chapter 13. At the beginning of the giving of the law, and then kind of toward the end of the Old Testament record in Nehemiah 13, we realize that the people were not honoring the Sabbath law. Nehemiah chapter 13. By the way, as you're turning over there, the reason Nehemiah is having to restore so much and to help rebuild the walls of Jerusalem is because Jerusalem had been sacked and had been burned down in large part by the Babylonians. And for 70 years, the lands surrounding Jerusalem were lying fallow. You know why? God said, because you did not, among other things, keep the Sabbath, my land is going to get 70 years, as if to say 10 times a Sabbath rest, to make up for what it lost under your work on it. And so after all that, they come back, and yet Nehemiah chapter 13, notice verse 15. In those days, I saw people in Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath, and bringing in sheaves, and loading donkeys with wine, grapes, figs, and all kinds of burdens, which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I warned them about the day on which they were selling provisions. Did you catch the level of detail there? It was not just, they were working and they were engaging in agricultural pursuits. He says even the donkeys were being loaded down with burdens. Remember what God said in the law? Not just you and your children and your manservants and your female servants and your strangers and guests, even your oxen and your donkeys are to rest on the Sabbath. And yet they were loading down even the creatures on the Sabbath. In verse 16, men of Tyre dwelt there also, who brought in fish and all kinds of goods and sold them on the Sabbath to the children of Judah and in Jerusalem. Then I contended with the nobles of Judah and said to them, what evil thing is this that you do, by which you profane the Sabbath day? Did not your fathers do thus, and did not our God bring all this disaster on us and on the city? Yet you bring added wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath. So it was at the gates of Jerusalem, as it began to be dark before the Sabbath, that I commanded the gates to be shut, and charged that they must not be opened till after the Sabbath. Then I posted some of my servants at the gates, so that no burdens would be brought in on the Sabbath day. Now the merchants and sellers of all kinds of wares lodged outside Jerusalem once or twice. Then I warned them and said to them, why do you spend the night around the wall? If you do so again, I will lay hands on you. From that time on, they came no more on the Sabbath, and I commanded the Levites that they should cleanse themselves and that they should go and guard the gates to sanctify the Sabbath day. Remember me, O my God, concerning this also, and spare me according to the greatness of your mercy. You know how God took it when they would not observe the Sabbath day? On one level, it was, I gave you a command and an ordinance to be observed until I tell you not to do it. And you have flagrantly broken that and rebelled against me. I think there's a second thing going on. God meant the Sabbath to be a blessing and a spiritual education. God said, you rest. You don't have to work. You don't have to suffer the curse of the garden on this one day. And I will make the land bear forth on the 7th year to take care of you. And you can be free in the 50th year, the year of Jubilee, the year of jubilation and of freedom. And Israel, in effect, said, no thanks, we prefer the curse of the garden. We prefer working. We prefer toil. We prefer all of that to what you commanded us to do. We prefer slavery and toil to your offer of blessing. In the Scripture, God never seems to take it in a very positive way. when we take the riches of His blessings and we turn our face and we say, no thanks. God would not leave His people, though, forever without a Sabbath rest. Go with me to Isaiah chapter 61. In Isaiah 61, we have a servant of the Lord who speaks up. And in Isaiah 61, we get the first person voice of this servant who is coming someday to bring some very, very good news about a Sabbath and a Jubilee restoration. Isaiah 61 and verse 1. Listen carefully. Isaiah 61 and verse 1. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach good tidings to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to those who are bound, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord, and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, to console those who mourn in Zion, to give them beauty for ashes, the oil of joy for mourning, the garment of praise for the spirit of heaviness, that they may be called trees of righteousness, the planting of the Lord, that He may be glorified. Here the prophet, the servant of the Lord, speaks up and he says, a Jubilee year is here, in which those who mourn, those who are enslaved, those who are poor, are going to be freed. So let's go to Luke chapter 4. Luke chapter 4. In Luke 4, we have just been told about the beginning of Jesus' ministry, and this is kind of the kickoff chapter for Jesus' public ministry. So look in Luke chapter 4, and look with me to verse 16. So he came to Nazareth where he had been brought up, and as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up to read. And he was handed the book of the prophet Isaiah, and when he had opened the book, he found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord." Then he closed the book and gave it back to the attendant and sat down. And the eyes of all who were in the synagogue were fixed on him. And he began to say to them, "Today, this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." When Jesus healed on the Sabbath, was he laboring? Was he working? Yes. But he was not violating the Sabbath law at all. He was fixing the Sabbath observance of the Jews and teaching them, I am doing on this Sabbath day by healing the man with the withered hand, by raising up this woman who is bent over, by healing the man with the dropsy and that kind of condition. I am freeing and restoring these people's physical health, and that then is the down payment, that is the illustration of what I am here to do spiritually. To heal the sin-sick and burdened soul, and to liberate you from the power of darkness and of the evil one, and to restore you into the Sabbath rest of our God and His blessings. That's what the Sabbath work of Jesus was about. It was trying to teach them and show them what the Sabbath rest of God was truly meant for. Go over with me to John chapter 5. This is another Sabbath healing of Jesus, and this is an instance where Jesus spells it out for them, clear as day, why He was doing this on the Sabbath. John chapter 5, at the beginning of this chapter, We're told about a certain pool, Bethesda, in Jerusalem. And the people who were sick or the blind, the lame, the disabled would sit and would lie around the pool. And there was this belief that when the water was stirred, that if they were brought down into the water, the first person there would be healed. And notice then John 5 and verse 5. Now a certain man was there who had an infirmity 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had been in that condition a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be made well?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, but while I'm coming, another steps down before me." Jesus said to him, "Rise, take up your bed and walk." And immediately the man was made well, took up his bed and walked. And that day was the Sabbath. The Jews therefore said to him who was cured, "It is the Sabbath. It is not lawful for you to carry your bed." He answered them, "He who made me well said to me, 'Take up your bed and walk.'" Then they asked him, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Take up your bed and walk'?" But the one who was healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, a multitude being in that place. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, now listen carefully, "See, you have been made well. Sin no more, lest a worse thing come upon you." Jesus freed him on the Sabbath from his physical infirmity so that he could give proof and evidence of what he was here to do for that man and everyone else, and to free them from slavery and indentured service that we have committed to sin. Verse 16 then. For this reason the Jews persecuted Jesus and sought to kill him, because he had done these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, "My Father has been working until now, and I have been working." What did he just say to the Jews? You are not allowed to do that on the Sabbath. No work on the Sabbath. And you know what the Jews, if they could have filled in the blanks, could have said? Because our Creator Almighty rested on the seventh day and hallowed the Sabbath. And we're to do no work on the Sabbath. Jesus replied, "My Father has been laboring up until now, and I have too." Not a creative labor, but a restorative labor. And Jesus is trying to teach them, you have been blind to all that God has been doing and working to bring you into rest. And you would not have it. And I am here to continue and to accomplish that work. In verse 18, therefore the Jews sought all the more to kill him, because he not only broke the Sabbath, but also said that God was his Father, making himself equal with God. And now in verse 19, in the few verses following, Jesus is going to teach them what kind of liberation, what kind of rest he was coming to give. And that his Sabbath labors of miracles was pointing toward. Jesus answered and said to them, "Most assuredly I say to you, the Son can do nothing of himself, but what he sees the Father do. For whatever he does, the Son also does in like manner. For the Father loves the Son and shows him all things that he himself does. And he will show him greater works than these, that you may marvel. For as the Father raises the dead and gives life to them, even so the Son gives life to whom he will." The Father has a work in mind, and that is to raise the spiritually dead and to give them, rather invite them into his Sabbath rest. And I'm here to give that. And the Sabbath miracles pointed toward that great lesson about Jesus' mission and the nature of it. So let's then make this personal. Go over to Hebrews chapter 4. As you're turning over to Hebrews 4, we are reminded that when Christ was laboring on the Sabbath, he was not violating the Sabbath law, nor was he encouraging such. Nor was he proving that good deeds outweigh the violation of God's will, but he was performing these miracles so he could illustrate the true power and the lesson of the Sabbath. That God wanted liberation for us from the burden and the barren toil of sin. And so in Hebrews chapter 4 then, notice verse 1. Therefore, since a promise remains of entering his rest, let us fear, lest any of you seem to have come short of it. What did he just get done saying? He was going over in chapter 3 about the wilderness generation. They did not enter the land because of unbelief. And so he calls the promised land the kind of rest of God, that the one generation who did believe and would make it through the wilderness, they entered the rest of the promised land. And so he says, you Christian, you're in the wilderness now, you have a promised land to look forward to. Look in verse 2. For indeed the gospel was preached to us as well as to them. But the word which they heard did not profit them, not being mixed with faith in those who heard it. For we who have believed do enter that rest, as he has said, so I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. Although the works were finished from the foundation of the world. For he has spoken in a certain place of the seventh day in this way, and God rested on the seventh day from all his works, and again in this place they shall not enter my rest. Since therefore it remains that some must enter it, and those to whom it was first preached did not enter because of disobedience, again he designates a certain day, saying in David, today, after such a long time, as it has been said, today if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. For if Joshua had given them rest, then he would not afterward have spoken of another day. There remains therefore a rest for the people of God. For he who has entered his rest has himself also ceased from his works, as God did from his. This is one of those passages where it's not something that you just consume and metabolize and move on your way. You've got to sit and soak in it. And notice that the tense of verbs is so crucial. The Hebrew writer has been making the point. When it said that God rested on the seventh day and hallowed the Sabbath, and then in the Psalms when he said, they shall not enter my rest, the Hebrew writer in effect is saying, all right, look, so if there is still a rest remaining and they didn't enter it, and God has a rest remaining from God's people, was the promised land that ultimate rest? Well, no, because they had already entered it. And yet he said there's still a rest remaining. So what's the rest that's remaining for God's people? Notice he says it's not heaven. We do now, presently, enter that rest. If you have submitted to Jesus Christ and his lordship and his authority and all that his apostles commanded to be done, you have been brought into the spiritual Sabbath rest of God. Because you have been healed of your spiritual brokenness and sin, and you have been given liberation from the bondage of sin. We enter that rest now, presently. And yes, of course, there is the ultimate, unending Sabbath rest of eternity. And yet we get now to enjoy the year of Jubilee that Christ came in to announce, that is open to all. So here are the applications. If you have a sin-sick, burdened soul, and you realize how spiritually tired and exhausted you are, a lifetime will never suffice to bring you the rest that you're searching for. It's in Jesus Christ. Come unto me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Jesus offers. Come to him and enter into his rest by faith. Confess him as Lord. Die to your old self, be buried in water of baptism, and then when you are raised up out of that water, you receive rest for your soul. I want to make another application for all of us here who have entered that rest. Do you labor and toil on the Sabbath, violating it now? If the Sabbath rest that God has ushered in through Christ in the age of the kingdom, and we enter that rest, those who are the faithful disciples, we can be like Israel of old and ignore the blessings and the sanctity of that Sabbath rest, and by laboring on the Sabbath, we can in effect say, I prefer the garden curse. And what that looks like then, spiritually, is for the child of God to have enjoyed that rest, to enjoy the freedom from sin and guilt and its consequences of spiritual separation from God. And then, if I allow the addiction or the temptation of some sin to dominate me and to dictate my time and resources, or if I choose to live day in, day out with anxiety and discouragement, and I refuse to enjoy the hope that God has given me, I am turning around in Sabbath rest and I'm laboring spiritually on it. And I'm breaking the Sabbath, the spiritual one, the real one that God has been teaching us about all along. For the citizens in the kingdom, accept His rest and live in it. And do not be entangled and bound up again in the bondage of sin. It's for freedom that Christ has set us free. And so, where this invitation now meets you and calls you and invites you is for, if those of you have not come to the Lord yet and have not entered that rest, we invite you this morning to find that in Christ and find that in the saving message of the gospel. Respond to that gospel. And you can come up here and it will be your statement and your announcement that you're accepting the year of Jubilee spiritually that Christ has brought in. And Christian, if you have gone back to violate the rest God has made possible for you, repent and turn back to Him and spiritually enjoy the blessings as God intended in His way. If we can encourage or help you in a public way, make that known while we stand, while we sing to encourage.